Canada Red and South Africa A1. For Canada, let's give a good round of applause for featured debaters, Dasha, Lily, and Tatiana. And for South Africa, let's hear it for Stefan, Rahul, and Amelia. The motion for the final of Heart of Europe 2014 is: this House believes that the EU should offer tangible support to pro-EU movements in Eastern Europe and post-Soviet states. On proposition, we have South Africa A1. On opposition, we have Canada Red. Please, let's welcome them to start the debate.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am incredibly proud to stand for a side that supports an organisation that supports objective goods. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to ask one first question. What is the EU that we're going to be discussing in today's debate? We say that it's a collection of internal and central European states that have a central parliament which tends to regulate those interstate politics, and last of all, it offers support through a central European bank, specifically when necessary, as we saw when they bailed out not only Greece but also Spain and Ireland in the Eurozone crisis. Second question we have to ask, why was the EU formed? In face of explicit influence by the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, and additionally, specific influence by the USA to try and oppose communism and try to implement its own alliances within society, the EU wanted its own independence, the EU wanted its own society. Second of all, they wanted no dependence on the USSR or the USA. That's specifically why they formed themselves. The EU specifically facilitates this by creating a fundamental political body that does the following. It represents all of the European states in a political aspect, which gives them additional political power as a total state and individually. Second of all, it gives them specific economic independence through diversity, which means they're not dependent on outside superpowers. Next point. What are these pro-EU movements we're discussing in today's debate? We're discussing states where the governments may or may not necessarily design to join the EU, but the actor we need to discuss in today's debate is specifically the population in this instance. We say that these populations specifically have taken a stance to want to join it. We see this in Ukraine, we see this in Moldova, we see this in Georgia, we see this in Turkey. Next point. We said that specifically the Ukraine prior to the Crimean invasion wanted to do this, and prior to extensive influence by them desired this. Russia specifically undermines this through extensively manipulative trade deals to try and manipulate them specifically, and Vladimir Putin's incredibly effective foreign policy at trying to undermine foreign states. So what are these post-Soviet states we're talking about? We're talking about countries that prior to the 1918 fall of the Iron Curtain, as it has been infamously titled, were one, economically dependent on the USSR, and second of all, politically manipulated the USSR either through political puppet democracies or through just political manipulation by military existence. We saw this, for instance, in Poland, but Poland rejected the Soviet state, joined the EU. We saw that they had the third fastest growing economy for the past 30 years, and they continue to institute economic reforms today. Next point. We tell that it's incredibly important to offer these states support so that we can prevent this from happening in the future, so that we can prevent them from falling onto economic dependence on other people, which we say that is just unacceptable because we want states to have fundamental sovereignty. Next. Let's give some degree of context about these Soviet states, not now. First of all, we tell you that they're specifically facing economic trouble. First of all, the reason for this is their dependence on the USSR, which was then severely severed in 1918. I'll tell you in a moment, ma'am, but not now. I've already told you this. Second of all, we see this in the reunification tax in Germany, where they specifically have to try and improve East Germany because of its slightly backward economy. That's a specific problem, that's a specific necessity for them to try and improve their economies. This is simply true, it's an unfortunate fact. Next point. We tell you that specifically because Russia manipulated these countries, we're talking about a case study like Ukraine, like Georgia, where Russia forced oil and gas pipes into their country for energy dependence, and specifically threatened to remove it if they joined the EU and Russia no longer had power. The reason why Russia is doing this is because they specifically want to remain a global power player. What is the support we're talking about? We say that first of all, it's the provisional allowance of being a member state of the EU, second of all, it's the use of the euro, third of all, it's financial aid to aid in development, and fourth of all, it's political support to prevent them from being manipulated. We said that this prevents all of the harms we have in these post-Soviet states. Thank you, and thank you very much. Now, when do we say we support this, and this is where our criteria come in twofold. But before I do, I'll take a point.
Okay, so you told us what tangible support is. Is your goal to make them an EU state in the future? What's your goal for these states?
No, we tell you that we don't want to force, so we don't want to infringe upon our country's sovereignty, specifically what we're standing against. We say that if there's this tangible pro-EU movement within that country, within that country's people, we want to support that. We want to support that people, those people, and second of all, we don't want to stand against what that country's government, we want to stand against what that country's government wants if that isn't congruent with what their people want. Into my aims. First of all, we tell it when an organisation has to support something when its aims oblige it to do so. Second of all, when those to whom the support is given benefit in terms of choice, in terms of principled idea, in terms of tangibles, in this case most likely the economy. So this brings me on to my substantive arguments. First of all, I'm going to be discussing the aims of the EU and why that argument falls to our side of the house, and how we fulfill our first criteria. Second of all, how we both benefit the EU and those countries themselves in terms of their choice, and second of all, in terms of their existence. And last of all, I'm going to be analysing a crucial actor in this case, Russia, and to a lesser extent, China. Let's get to my first argument, the aims of the EU. We said that there are 6 aims here. First aim, and these are self-identified. Peace, European values, and the citizens' well-being. 2, free movement within their with external border control. 3, construction of a free market whereby a single currency is used. Fifth of all, the EU shall promote its values, not now, contribute to eradicating poverty, observe human rights, and respect the Charter of the UN. And sixth of all, the EU shall pursue these objectives by appropriate means, according to its competences given in the tactics. Second, so we said that these aims are simply illegitimate on 2 fronts. First of all, precedent, and second of all, most importantly, categorical reason. We said that first of all, we said it's just accepted and it's irrational. We said that human rights, we said that democracy, we said that free movement, we said that economic independence, we said that political independence are things that everyone recognizes as objective goods. Second of all, because society recognizes them as objective goods, we say that they're simply categorical truths. Thus, we said that they're specifically legitimate. We said that how do the EU fulfill this? By giving them tangible support to prevent the inverse of these things happening, we help that. So thus, we fulfilled our first criteria. Second argument, why is choice important in these countries? We said that first of all they want it because of the internal political movements within them. We see in Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, I've already analysed why they want it. Now, we said that in terms of the nature of democracy, it's based on a principle of choice, which allows the individuals within it to actualise. Second of all, choice, moreover, needs to necessarily be based on a degree of knowledge. That's why political campaigns are so important to make a rational benefit way up. Therefore, the EU providing this info cannot be a bad thing, and it does 2 things. First of all, it counters anti-EU propaganda, and second of all, it allows people to make rational decisions after weighing both sides up. Therefore, it's legitimate, therefore we fulfill our second criteria, because we fulfill choice more. Next point, the benefits from its existence. We said that there's just an inherent benefit to the EU to diversify its economy, and an inherent benefit in terms of development to their economy. We said that this benefit is unquestionable. Ladies and gentlemen, I am incredibly proud to stand on the side that supports an organisation that supports democracy, that supports peace, that supports basic human rights, and supports categorical truths that cannot be ignored in today's debate. I ask side opposition to dare and oppose that. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks everyone for the first speech of the proposition, and invite Lily to offer the first speech of the opposition.
In March 2012,
The EU decided to lend a hand to Ukraine by way of the Ukraine-EU Association Agreement. Russia invaded and took over Crimea. The EU must look out for its member states. It must be cautious and calculative regarding Russia, and it must avoid pushing for inorganic acceptance of joining the EU by Eastern European and post-Soviet states. Now, on side opposition, we believe that the EU should never offer tangible support for any pro-EU movement because it is further unnecessary or ineffective. We are especially against tangible support in the case of Eastern European and post-Soviet states. Today we're going to analyze the EU, the post-Soviet states, the movements, and Russia. We're going to prove to you two things. Firstly, we're going to prove that the EU has no obligation to offer this tangible support. And secondly, that the outcome of tangible support is worse for all actors. But before I get to that, let's take a look at some rebuttal. Now, side proposition started his constructive case at 5.5 minutes, so there's not much to rebut. But let's take a look at what they tried to tell you. Okay, so they kind of clarified what tangible support was, right? They talked about economic funds and things like that. But we have to ask, how much are these people going to get? How are they going to get it? Because obviously these are certain specific groups in these certain countries. Who is it going to go through, and who is going to be accountable for these people getting certain monetary funds? They need to clarify that. Also, we asked them at POI what the goal of their giving support was, and if they were going to accept every member. They said, no, that's ridiculous, and we're not going to do that, absolutely not. Well, first of all, that is just a waste of resources. They're now pouring in money to countries that aren't going to be in the EU. There's no point. And secondly, they told you that there's this, they tried to use really good rhetoric, right? They told you we need to unify. We need to have human rights movements. We need to make a country and an EU group that is unified altogether. We tell you, first of all, we're not, and no one is, actively oppressing these certain countries. So that point fully falls on that point. No thanks. Okay, so we have to ask this one fundamental question. What makes being in the EU so good? What makes it so that these countries need to be joining them? It's necessary for them to join. They need to clarify that.
Allow me.
No thanks. Okay, so let's go to my first contention about this moral obligation. So first of all, we think they have a responsibility to their own situation. Let's take a look at the European Union and the status of the European Union today. And there's an overwhelming consensus that the EU is just unfit to accept more parties, more countries. First of all, it's very politically divisive. 100 out of 751 members of the European Parliament is anti-EU. But furthermore, in addition, unemployment rates have jumped by 4% to 10.4% since the financial crisis. And the debt-to-GDP ratio has jumped by 20% to 87.4%. Because they're now promising these countries who are not economically stable billions and billions of dollars to bail them out. This problem is only going to exacerbate when you put these countries that are not fit into the EU. So how are they doing this in this motion? Well, by supporting the pro-EU movements, they're diverting attention and resources to these countries and civilians rather than dealing with their own problems in their own countries. We think that they could be doing a better job by solely focusing on the EU, by solely focusing on their own problems, because obviously they have a lot. And also it's more effective if they do that. No thanks. So, why do we think they should be prioritizing? Well, mainly because, first and foremost, a government is responsible for the people in their own nation, especially in the EU. The government just doesn't have a responsibility to other citizens of other nations, right? And so that's why we think they should be solely focusing on their own nation. And secondly, basically the EU's main goal is to be strong, to be stable, and to be successful. And they don't do this by accepting members that just don't fit the criteria, socially, with economic policies, and with foreign ones. And this just doesn't include where inside of Europe your country is situated. This is just an arbitrary factor. They need to clarify why being in Eastern Europe is a factor that should prioritize you to be accepted into the EU. In other words, just because your country is a part of the eastern side of Europe doesn't mean you should be given extra consideration. That's what side proposition needs to establish. Now, let's go into my second contention about the harms to the EU. Now, there are a couple subpoints under this. Firstly, I'm going to be talking about how it's a waste of resources, especially when you don't accept these states into the EU, which they aren't going to, like side proposition already told us. So ultimately, there are a lot of Eastern European countries who, again, just don't simply and fundamentally fit the criteria of an EU member state. This is why, after years of campaigning and support, these countries have not been accepted into the EU. Therefore, we think that by giving tangible support to these countries that don't fit the criteria and never will, which is actually a lot, like 33 countries, isn't effective and in fact is a waste of resources. And let me tell you why. So even if they wanted to accept these countries, I'll tell you in a minute, there are certain scenarios, and I'm going to show you these examples of certain countries, but first, because he's so eager, let's let him.
Madam, if you'd like to analyse the economic issues of the Eurozone, analyse the Eurozone crisis, not the nature of the EU itself, which you haven't done anyway. First issue, and second of all, it's caused by a lack of regulation, which has been solved.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to tell you the main goal of the EU is to be economically stable. It's not to be a bigger EU in general, right? It's to have a strong, stable core. The main goal of the EU is not to just bring other countries and make it stronger, because that's not going to happen, and I'm going to show you why. So even if they wanted to accept, why wouldn't they? First of all, let's look at the best situation, right? Let's look at the example of Turkey. Turkey is in one of the best situations, if you could say, in Eastern Europe. But they've only met 15 out of 35 membership criteria. And that's in the best scenario. In the worst, Macedonia has only met 10, and on average, a country like Serbia has met 13. Mr. Speaker, in order to be accepted into the EU, you have to meet 33 of the criteria. We don't think by adding tangible support to certain groups, specific groups in certain countries, is going to get them a step closer to being economically stable, to be in the EU. Also, let's talk about how if there's a divide in politics and economics, especially if you accept these states, and how they're going to make the situation actually worse. So why is this bad? Well, first of all, their economy is not strong. Their politics are estranged. Foreign policies misaligned. For example, these countries are not going to have the exact same mindset, especially with countries in the EU. And lastly, aside from being bad for the EU in itself, we forgot about someone. Well, actually, side proposition brought them up nicely for us. Russia. Josh is going to go into this a little bit further, but we need to focus on Russia because tension between Russia and the EU will increase drastically because Russia will now view the EU as infringing on states that they wish and think they deserve to control. What does Russia want at the end of the day? Well, they want control. And when we say, hey, we're taking X state away from you, now they're going to get angry, and that's just a risk we don't want to take on side opposition. Now, because we're a side that knows EU's capabilities, or in fact, what they aren't capable of, we're so proud to oppose.
Thanks, Lily, for the first speech of the opposition. And we invite now Amelia for the second speech of proposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not an angry person, but I literally stayed up till 5 o'clock in the morning today so that I could understand the complexity of this issue and so that I could construct a case that I fundamentally believe in. So you can understand my anguish when side opposition comes up here and has the audacity to negate all of our harms with an argument about backlash and a misunderstanding of how regulations work. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm incredibly proud to stand with side proposition, a side that supports the support of an organization that's objectively good. This is still our stance in today's debate, and this is still why I'm proud to stand here. I have one point for positive matter that I bring you today, and that's the overwhelming benefits that creates the EU. This contests every other point that they brought in that I won't already address in my rebuttal. But let's get on to the first point of rebuttal about the contestation about our policy and about how we have to give a generalized view of every single case. To which we just say, ladies and gentlemen, we don't have to tell you how much aid we're going to provide in every single case, nor do we have to tell you which organization is going to administer that aid in every single case. Because of the very fact that it is so case-specific, that it changes from every single country. There is literally an asterisk next to almost every single country's name when you look at how they're involved in the EU. Policy is
change according to these different countries all the time. We don't have to give you some sort of generalized view about how this is going to work all the time. Secondly, let's deal with the idea of like our acceptance policy, which they also contested. The first thing that we told them, which still hasn't been rebutted, is that the benefits that we get aren't undermined by whether they're accepted into the EU or whether they're not accepted into the EU. This is a fundamental clash on ideologies, supporting liberal views when in the face of the repressive, conservative views that come from Russia. They have to deal with that analysis. But more than that, we say that it often can be likely that we can accept some sort of membership. Once again, these policies change all the time, so it is very dependent on the specific case. Then they asked us why we give Eastern Europe specific attention. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we say that being in Europe is probably some sort of criteria because it's very close to home for the rest of the countries and therefore has a direct influence on the way that those countries operate. But more than that, ladies and gentlemen, we say that these are areas that are specifically being oppressed. When Russia comes in with the military into Crimea, we would argue that someone needs to do something about it. We would argue that the body that is like set on upholding liberal ideals and helping people should probably do that. More than that, ladies and gentlemen, they're historically linked. We told you about the creation of the EU in my first speech. Lastly, thirdly, let's deal with the ideas to the harms of the economy that we create. And basically, they brought us this idea of the bailout problem. Ladies and gentlemen, the reason that we had a problem with the economies of the EU was literally because regulation wasn't upheld by the EU. Every single harm in today's debate that they brought up can literally be solved by regulation. You have to show us why all of the harms are only linked to membership within the EU and can't be solved by stricter regulations. More than that, we're already passing new regulations about the amount that you can borrow. You have to show us why it's specifically about being a member of the EU. More than that though, ladies and gentlemen, we say that you already accepted efficacy in some sort of way, because all of the harms that you brought to us are contingent on these countries being a member of the EU, so that's important to note. They've accepted the efficacy of our case. More than that though, we just tell you that Romania and Bulgaria in the EU are doing pretty well. We don't think that they're sinking that much. The economy is small, the economy is growing. So, let's get on to the last point of positive matter, which is basically the very short analysis about the backlash that we get from Russia. So, ladies and gentlemen, the first thing that we tell you is that we still do things that we think are objectively good, even if we have backlash. By their own analysis, we wouldn't allow black people to vote in America because there was a considerable amount of backlash when that happened. If it is still an objectively good action and could lead to objectively good actions in the future, we would still do it. No, thank you. Secondly, though, we say that we just don't think that there is going to be that much of a backlash. We see a European president trending towards acceptance of the EU. What we actually see is some sort of backlash against Russia, because they're very scary, they're coming in with military, and they're incredibly harmful. A harm, by the way, that they've conceded when they're talking about how they're going to come in, going to invade these countries because of their demand for power. So, basically, we have a side of the House today that's accepted all the harms of Russia, that's accepted that our policy could be effective, and that has given us no real reason as to why it's going to hurt everyone else. Ladies and gentlemen, so far we're winning. So let's get on to my point of positive matter, which clashes directly with all their analysis about like EU's obligation and why this hurts them so much. So ladies and gentlemen, we agree that the European Union's stability is incredibly important for global stability just because of its stature in the world. More than that though, we say that through support, through an increase in trade, and through a freer kind of trade economy, we can actually grow the EU's stability. Why? Two major reasons. The first thing is, when we allow some country support for pro-EU movements, we're essentially supporting pro-liberal movements, right? So when you allow that kind of support, when you facilitate that kind of information, it automatically means that the anti-EU movements or the pro-Russian movements are decreased in some sort of way. We say that what that means is that you then free up trade within those economies, right? Because it's no longer as strict, like I really don't want to trade with you because Russia doesn't have many friends, so when you trade with Russia, it often means that you trade exclusively with Russia. We say that therefore, any kind of weakening of Russia's regime is a good thing because it frees up that kind of trade barrier. So, this point of analysis isn't contingent on actually becoming a member of the EU. It just states that once you start to move away from just trading with Russia because you support other ideals in that country too, it means that you can start to free up that kind of trade area. It means that the EU can start to trade more. It's not a waste of money. Secondly though, we just say that you move directly towards EU trade because the specific organizations that we're supporting, that's important too. But more than that, since they've already accepted that there is some sort of efficacy in our policy, let's just ask the question, what are the benefits to that? We say that firstly, there's an ample opportunity of investment within these particular areas. We think that that's particularly true when they join the EU. So the reason for that is when a country joins the EU, they automatically become better, I'll take you in a moment, in terms of economic prospects, because the EU has such high stature, yes.
But what does the EU benefit when they're giving and pouring this money into these certain pro-movements when the country isn't going to join the EU?
Okay, so one, you've already conceded through all of your harms that they're going to join the EU, so you have to speak about that too. But more than that, I literally just told you, we free up some sort of trade within the region. That's what we do when we weaken all of the Russia problems that we are having at the moment. You have to deal with that analysis side pro-human. So, let's deal with the second movement, the second idea though, about what we're doing when we result in some sort of inclusion within the EU. So I've already told you about the opportunity for investment, why this becomes more attractive for foreign powers when a country is now associated with the EU. But secondly though, we say that Eastern European countries specifically have a large population of younger workers. After the Iron Curtain was lifted, there was a 60% increase in birth rate, and that population has now risen to the workforce. Why is this so beneficial to Europe specifically? We say that in terms of developing skills, it's a good prospect. We say that young people often spend more. We say that there is a direct link in the economies growing faster with a younger workforce, and an old workforce is a problem that Europe is particularly facing now. So ladies and gentlemen, we've essentially proven benefits to EU. We've essentially proven overwhelming benefits to countries that are currently being oppressed. We have to see a side opposition that actually brings us a case today. I'm incredibly proud to stand beside the opposition.
Thank you, Emilia, for that speech. Now we invite Dasha to deliver the second speech, the opposition.
At the end of their speech asked us to give them a practical example when they told us they wanted to debate it hypothetically about all of the EU. But because we're so strongly against this motion, we're not only going to prove to you that this is practically harmful in a majority of cases, but also that this is morally wrong on a hypothetical level. As the second speaker for side opposition, I'm going to do a few things. First off, I'm going to refute everything they told you. Second off, I'm going to rebuild these points which we think weren't addressed properly. And finally, I'll get into my constructive about harms to post-Soviet states. Okay, so first off, some refutation. I want to look at this under two main themes. So first off, is there a moral obligation? The main thing they told you under this theme was that the purpose of the EU is to have democracy and unity in Europe. We have a number of responses. The first thing that we tell you is that the purpose of the EU right now in the situation is to have stability and to be successful. Whether or not they want democracy, the fact is they are in a pretty bad situation that applies to most of the states. We think that if they include most of these actors, which simply can't contribute anything, are in pretty volatile positions, that's bad for them. But second off, even if we agree that their purpose is democracy and unity and all those things, we think this degrades the point of the EU. The point of the EU is that it's exclusive, that it's conditional, that you have to have a good democracy, that you have to have certain standards in order to actually be in there. Once you just allow it to anyone simply on the arbitrary basis that they're a post-Soviet state, they don't actually have to meet the requirements, that they are democratic, that they have those sort of obligations. The next idea we heard under this is that, we need to protect their human rights. That's why we have a moral obligation to step in. First off, they haven't actually given you specific examples as to how there are active human rights abuses in these countries, and why, by supporting them, by giving them monetary support, that's actually going to stop those human rights abuses. We told you on our side of the house that it isn't necessarily going to do that. They haven't actually sent you that analysis. But assuming that analysis did exist, we would oppose to it on a fundamental ideological level. We would tell you that you have an obligation to your own citizens first, because they elected you, because they pay taxes, they contribute to it. So if we can prove to you that it hurts their own countries and their own citizens, it doesn't matter if we have a responsibility to protect them. We think this is an arbitrary characteristic. Finally, the last idea we heard under moral obligation is we need to give people this right to choose between their futures. A few responses. responses. First off, why do you need the EU to choose this? Sorry, why do you need EU support to choose this? A lot of these countries already know the pros and cons of joining the EU. They gave you the example of Moldova. 97% of Moldovans are actually against joining the EU, unlike what they'd have you believe. We think they do know what the debate is going on. But furthermore, we tell you is it actually makes it harder to make a rational choice. Why? Because they're creating a false dichotomy. They're telling you either you side with Europe or you side with Russia. That's false. You can't have both, and it is possible to maintain relationships. You don't have to make that choice. And we think if they're forcing you to make that, that is not a realistic choice for someone to make. The second area of contention that came up, the second theme, is this effective? We think they give you two things under that. The first one is what the previous speaker talked about in terms of trade with the EU and how this is going to help them economically. First off, once again we see a dichotomy. It's not true that you should only have trade with either Russia or the EU. Also, we think that if you force them to pick one side, that just alienates the other actor and antagonizes them even more. I'm going to talk about that later on. But furthermore, what we tell you is it's actually bad for them economically. We think there's essentially a domino effect. In response to these points, I told you, like, oh, Romania is doing pretty well. Once you include more actors, it makes it a higher chance that if they're economically unstable, they're going to affect the other countries. If you're putting other countries at risk in this situation, if you're putting your own citizens at risk, it doesn't matter if there's going to be more trade, if it's ultimately harmful for everyone. So now to move on to rebuilding Lily's points. So first off, we want to point out that they actually didn't deal with all the sub-points analysis she gave you. She never addressed how we need to care about our own citizens first on a fundamental level, or why specifically, like Soviets, have this something so special about them that we have a moral obligation to them. They never addressed those points. What did they tell you? First off, they told you it's not really about these states, it's about a clash of ideologies. Mr. Speaker, this is essentially a proxy war. We're using these countries, not for their own benefit, but rather to say, like, liberal ideals are better than, like, Russia's ideals. That is wrong, first off, because they haven't proven to you why these ideals are better. But second off, if this actually screws over those post-Soviet states, like I'm going to prove to you in my constructive, it doesn't matter. We think it's wrong to use them as means to an end, and an end that possibly isn't even beneficial. Finally, they give you this, like, really weird analogy of, like, black people voting, and somehow that applies. First off, we think that's a basic human right. You don't have a human right to be in the EU. We think the whole purpose of the EU is that not everybody gets in. We think it's something that you have to earn in this sort of case. We think ultimately they never show you why this applies in any sort of situation. We think they haven't shown you the moral responses. So ultimately, they haven't adequately dealt with Lily's points. They haven't actually talked about Ukraine and all the things we talked about. No thanks. Finally, the last thing I want to do before we finish my constructive is just Ukraine, because we think that's the framework of this debate. What we tell you is that Ukraine is actually the byresult of the product of their side of the house. Because what happens is you force Russia to actually, like, take these hard stances. The reason Russia did things like cut off the gas is because they saw the EU was forcing people to go against them. Once Russia cut off the gas, then the EU forced to respond and retaliate by kicking out the government. Then Russia had to respond by invading Crimea. So ultimately, if you want this ping-pong, like, back and forth battle between these countries, using Ukraine as their battleground, that's what you get on their side of the house. We think that's a terrible thing. So now I'm going to move on to my constructive entitled How This Harms Post-Soviet States. What we're going to prove to you is that the harm to these post-Soviet states negate any obligations of the European Union. Ultimately, if it screws them over, it's morally wrong as well. Why? Before I go on to the Quran.
You're specifically talking to us about how you want to improve the economic situation in the Eurozone. If you want that, then you stand on outside of the house. We told you about diversity.
No, we don't think that applies in this case at all, because first off, the EU is already economically unstable. Whether or not we have regulations doesn't apply, because the status quo is one where it isn't already effective and we need, like, to stop in some sort of way. But by bringing in even more unstable actors, they never show you why it's going to become more stable. Diversity doesn't matter. Okay, so back to my point. Ultimately, what we tell you is that this turns these countries into battlegrounds for proxy wars. Why? We think that when Russia sees the EU showing interest in turning an ex-Soviet state, a potential ally, into a European state, they're incentivized to take action. Why? Because we think the incentive of Russia is to be perceived as someone important, perceived as a threat, and an important agent in that region. We think that ultimately, if they can have this image as rebuilding the Soviet Union, as having a sort of glory and power that they used to have before, that's sort of the image that they want to have. So why is this bad for states when you now force Russia to intervene because you create this dichotomy between choosing one or the other? Ultimately, when both the EU and Russia, one controls the area, one mobilizes a certain actor, the other mobilizes another. In most of these cases, the situations are split. Like oftentimes, Russia's acting through the government, or the people are pro-EU. We see this sort of fundamental conflict. The impact of that is that we get conflicts that are unnecessary and aren't totally representative of their beliefs. We gave you the example of Ukraine. We ultimately think that these forces these countries to actually have to deal with Russia's escalation and aggression of the situation, because if keep on going back and forth based on fundamental ideological purposes and political purposes rather than what's actually best for Ukraine. They do this to further their own self-interest. Why is that a good thing? They haven't proven it to you. But furthermore, we think it's actually harmful to post-Soviet states because it actually alienates them further from the EU. So if you ultimately want them to, and they want to be part of the EU, but now you feel like the EU is coercing you into doing this, like they're convincing you to, and they're making you like choose between, say, your past or Russia or whatever you want to choose between, and the EU. It makes you feel like they're not actually giving you anything in return. They're doing this on purpose. They don't want to join the EU because they're forcing them to make this choice rather than allowing them to deliberate and discuss it on their own. So even if the EU might be seen as potentially beneficial organically, they won't see it anymore as this because it's seen as manipulative. It alienates them from a potentially beneficial relationship. So even if the EU is a good idea, they're less likely to join into it. I think that's a harm on their side. So what do we care about on-site opposition? We care about what's best for Europe, but most importantly, we also care about, is this morally justified and is this going to be beneficial for the states that are being impacted? Because we say no to all these questions, we're extremely proud to oppose.
Thank you, Natasha, for the second speech of the opposition. Now let's welcome Rahul for the third speech of the opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes things are difficult but necessary. Sometimes it's necessary to fight for an ideology that is bigger than you and worth supporting. Side opposition has lost this debate because they have not been able to understand that fundamental principle. But over and above that, they've lost the debate for the three following reasons. One, at the start of the debate, they conceded the harms of Russia when they made their own point about the harms of Russia. They then conceded that Russia wants control. They conceded the harm, they told you it's likely to happen, and yet they gave you no efficacy on their side of the house, no mechanism to tell you why they prevent the harm. Yet throughout this entire debate, we've been showing you how we undermine the conservative ideals and we undermine Russia. They conceded the harm, by their own admission they lose. Two, ladies and gentlemen, they told you that the EU just wants to be a stable economy without understanding what the EU actually needs, wants, and supports. And I'll go into that later. Ignoring our economic analysis is not a response to the economic analysis. And thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, they set a burden for themselves at the start of the debate that they've just failed to uphold. Because they told you, not just that they would show that we don't need to provide support to Soviet states, etc. They showed you that the EU should never provide support ever. That was their own stated burden. And I'll show you how by their own enlarged burden, they have to lose the debate. So without further ado, let's discuss what the EU ought to want or support. We tell you that the EU is founded on some core tenets, some core principles. This is what we started with. We told you that the EU supports peace. It supports dignity, it supports freedom of movement, free market, and overall goodness for the citizens. All that they did with that was try to oversimplify the EU. They ignored the EU's principles, they ignored the ideals that the EU should be supporting. Instead, they said that the EU just wants to be a good economy. Let's respond to that. First of all, no, that's an oversimplification of the EU, as I said, but more importantly, it's an oversimplification specifically now when the EU is fighting a war of ideologies to undermine an oppressive, conservative ideology that is currently spreading through Eastern Europe. You cannot tell us that all the EU cares about is the economics when the EU is actively engaging in trying to protect the people of Europe from something oppressive and harmful. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that there are active advantages to the EU when they have the ideologies that they do, because of the perception that they create, because of the way people want to support the EU, because of the fact that human freedom and dignity are fundamentally good things, and people like that. But then let's deal with the analysis that they brought you anyways, where they first of all said that the EU shouldn't provide support because it's just a waste of money to provide support to states that won't join the EU. First of all, I'll tell you that they conceded the efficacy when they said when they tried to provide harms that were contingent on states joining the EU. But then I'll go further by saying that one, the EU values ideologies like peace, dignity, and freedom, and the EU ought to support the states. And it's not a waste of money if the EU can support those important ideals. But two, and more importantly, we tell you that when those states that may not join the EU currently have a struggle between liberal and conservative ideals, and the EU can actively support the liberal movement by providing support there, and undermine the oppressive conservative regimes, then we tell you that that is most certainly not a waste of money, and that's just an absurd assertion. Then they told you that the EU should just favour economic stability. We tell you that was also just an assertion. We got no analysis as to why that's true. But over and above that, I'm going to go into the economic analysis later. The economic analysis we provided, where we told you specifically how you do get state stability and even economic growth on our side of the house. Lastly, they told you that you just hurt the economy when you accept weak states into the EU. First of all, that's just a flagrantly offensive statement to the Eastern European and post-Soviet states to assert that they're all just weak. We tell you that many of them are actually very small but rapidly growing economies because of their young workers force that have been incredibly productive. Over and above that though, we have specific economic analysis which I told you I'd bring up. When you accept more states into the EU, you provide diversity. What this means is that you have more different types of products being produced within one zone, you have a more successful and stable economy, because when your economy has to respond to global economic fluctuations, you have different products, and you can ensure that you always have some kind of demand for your products. But over and above that, we told you that when the EU undermines the conservative ideals and ensures that it always gets trade, its economy is also then more stable because it has constant trade and it has a better economy. So now let's talk about the efficacy of the support. No, thank you. Because first of all, we told you that we definitely think that states will join the EU. Why? Because we provide info about good ideals like democracy that they'll recognize. We provide economic support. We provide economic development. We saw this in Poland. Poland is currently now a member of the EU. And fourthly, the people actually just want it. We've seen a European trend towards the EU. Then we told you that our support is particularly effective even when the states don't join the EU, because of what we do to support the right kind of ideals, to support the liberal ideals that we value in today's debate. Let's look at the responses that we got. One, they just brought us harms about weak states joining, which were all just contingent on our efficacy being effective, so they conceded that. Two, they gave you the economic assertions, which we rebutted. They still haven't dealt with our economic analysis. Three, they told you that Russia is just going to backlash, and that's a problem for our efficacy. Our response there is firstly, since when have we let radical minorities dictate policy and decide what we should and shouldn't do? We tell you that we do things when they're objectively good. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we don't think Russia can backlash, because the EU, believe it or not, is a whole lot more powerful than Russia, ladies and gentlemen. But over and above that, we're actively supporting the liberal movements and undermining Russia. Russia becomes progressively weaker. Then they told you that they don't like the efficacy of our support, where we provide liberal ideals or conservative ideals. Because they said that, I'll take you just now, we just don't know that liberal ideals are better. We tell you that that analysis is easy to rebut. Liberal ideals are better because there are some fundamental human objective truths that we all value. We all like dignity, we all like not being oppressed. It's absurd for them to tell you that conservative ideals could possibly be better than liberal ideals when the conservative regime in Russia is oppressing homosexuals. That's not okay, that can't be accepted. I'll take a POI now.
You said Russia's a radical minority and nobody would listen to it, and yet they still have the power to do things like cut off trade and make you feel politically alienated and do things that can cripple your economy. How is that not a big impact?
So, no, you must understand the point there, right? Firstly, Russia is definitely a minority in the greater scheme of the EU. There is a greater support for the liberal ideals. But secondly, the entire point of the analysis is just to show you that when bad people want to do bad things, we don't stop doing good things because the bad people might potentially complain afterwards. We told you that we allow black people to vote because we risked the backlash. So then they said that forcing people to accept the liberal ideals is just not okay, right? And we respond to that on a few levels. Firstly, we never force anyone. We provide information, we let them make way ups, and we provide support for their movements. Secondly, we tell you that it's particularly effective when they attack our efficacy, because we say that we actively provide them with the economic support to fund their movement further, and we actively give them the support of the entire EU, an incredibly large and powerful institution. So what's left in the debate now? If we assume that everything I just said is false, we remain with one truism in the debate. The EU provides support, guarantees good liberal ideals. It undermines conservative regimes, irrespective of
funny that in her whole speech she told us our side was being overly simplistic, and then we went to talk about how the EU supports overall goodness, ladies and gentlemen. We think if you're simplifying things, that's a prime example. With that in mind, let's stop accusing each other of being simplistic, and let's first ask 3 questions about what do you actually need to understand about this debate, and what do you need to understand about the EU, right? Okay, so what do you need to understand? First of all, the EU is not in need of new states, right? The only reason they'd accept it if there was a mass benefit for themselves. Secondly, it requires a lot of work to join the EU, right? The EU doesn't pay to get people suitable to join the EU. The EU makes people earn it, and then if they're good enough, they accept them. Finally, you need to understand that right now we aren't debating a hypothetical EU because there's only one situation where the EU applies. That's now. We need to debate how the EU is, and they're not in a position to be taking risks right now. We think that that's what side of proposition has failed to understand. Okay, so with that we're going to be analyzing 3 main themes. We're first going to look at the moral purpose and obligation. Then we're going to talk about the EU itself, and we think that's the most important theme on side opposition to prove. And then we're going to talk about the Soviet states and Russia. So first let's look at this idea about the moral obligation, right? The first thing we heard from side proposition was this idea that Russia is abusing people, therefore we need to help them. We heard a great counterpoint from Lily. She told you that, just because someone is in a region doesn't mean you have to help them. We told you, secondly,
these countries aren't actually being systematically oppressed by Russia, okay? Ukraine is the only situation that's gotten violent right now. We think that when we move in and look like we're trying to impede on these territory that Russia accepts as theirs, that's when we have problems, right? We think that that is when Russia actually starts trying to exert the influence, and that's when it gets worse for those countries. You'll hear more analysis later, okay? Secondly, we heard this idea of choice from them, and they told you it's really, okay. I'm not leaving over anymore. They told you it's really important that these countries have a free choice and they have all the information and they're not being oppressed by Russia. The first thing we told you is essentially they're complaining that Russia is creating propaganda and exerting influence, then they want to turn around and encourage their own propaganda and be like, no, the EU is better. We think principally you need to choose either propaganda or no propaganda. The second thing we tell you is you attract more negative Russia attention when you're actually in the country and encouraging EU movements because they feel like they need to counter you. No, thank you. And finally, we told you that when you support the EU, you act like when you support the EU movements in these countries, you actively set yourself against Russia and put the country in the position where they need to choose either you or Russia. We think that limits their choice. It limits their opportunity to stay loyal to both countries, have relations with both countries, or do what they think is best. No, thank you. Okay, finally, let's look at this idea of purpose. And we told you a lot about this on side proposition because we didn't really get a clear stance on side opposition. First of all, they told you we're not necessarily going to force these states to join, and we gave you the ultimate response that it's not in the EU's nature to take risks unless they're sure that they want that state to join, right? We think ultimately if they do that, they're simply wasting resources. So we told you it's illogical in that sense. But even if, for some reason, they did accept these perfectly unsuitable countries that don't meet their requirements, it would be bad for the EU economically. I'll analyze that in a second. Okay, they then tried to tell you that the benefits aren't negated. Under this theme, the benefits to the nation isn't negated when they aren't accepted into the EU, and we think they fundamentally understand the point of this, right? The first thing is that it's not about the benefits to the Soviet state, it's about the benefits to the EU, right? They're wasting their resources, ergo they shouldn't use it in the first place. But secondly, we tell you it is actually harmful to lead them on like this, to support an EU movement that's never going to happen, because you now put a country in the mindset where they want to join a state, they want to join the EU, but they're never going to get that, right? We don't think it's fair to lead them on and make them economically dependent on you when you have no intention of ever reciprocating. Okay, so with that, let's look at this next theme of analysis, the EU. And we think ultimately what they failed to understand on side proposition is that we need to prove why it's the best for the EU, right? It's not about the Soviet state, it's not about the moral obligation, it's not about Russia, it's about the fact that this is the EU's money, so they need to make the best choices with it. With that in mind, let's look at this idea of less resources. Lily brought it up, they didn't really respond to the idea that when you use resources on people outside of your country, you're not using them on resources for people inside the UN or the EU. We think that's fundamentally pretty important. They need to respond to that. Actually, yes. Do you have a response?
Actually, I do.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that whenever you give aid to another country, you don't take aid away from your own people. That's absurd. You always take excessive resources from the country. That's absurd.
We think that the difference between that is in one situation you have an undeveloped country who's being oppressed and who needs the aid, right? We don't think these people are like, if we aren't EU, we're going to die. If we aren't EU, our country is going to fail. No, we think that ultimately it's not the same because you have a moral obligation when people's lives are at risk and there's an imperative. We don't think that's created in these situations, right? Okay, so secondly, then we told you about economic instability. They accused us for not responding to a lot of their analysis, so I'll go through that really in depth right now. So the first thing they told you is that when we told you they're having problems right now, it can be solved by regulation. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, that regulation isn't happening. Therefore, they have to debate it in this realm where there is no regulation and we've had issues. Okay, secondly, they tried to tell you that if you support the EU rights in these countries, they'll be more willing to trade with the EU. Why do we think this is fundamentally false? We think in the status quo, when you're not actively trying to make a country European-centric, that's when you can trade with them. But when you try to force them to agree with you, Russia comes in and they have leverage over these countries, but they don't use it until they're forced to because they feel like the EU is going to take it away from them, right? We think that's when you create the ultimate harm. Okay, then they told us about younger workers being better for the potential for development and diversity. We tell you, what does Macedonia have that the EU doesn't, right? We think if they want to tell you about diversity, they need to explain why exactly it's so relevant, what that special resource is. Second, this idea about younger workers having the potential to improve the economy, we'd ask you why their economies aren't great right now. Why are they weak states? Like, obviously something is going wrong. They need to fix themselves before we even think about adding them to our volatile situation. No, thank you. Okay, finally, we told you
you that, unless you're sure that it will succeed, it's not the EU's place to take risks right now. Finally, we told you about political instability. Adding a country that's currently so divisive between communist and Russian and EU views is going to be a naturally volatile country. We told you that when you bring that viewpoint into the EU, it, one, weakens the EU, it changes the political schematic of the EU, and finally, we told you that ultimately, if you have too many of this and the EU gets too big in an unstable way because they don't all align in interests, you end up splitting the EU. So with that, let's move on to this final theme about the Soviet states. We don't think this is within our burden to prove the benefit, but we're going to do it anyways because I have 1 minute. Okay, so we essentially told you that this is starting a war on ideology. They agreed. They said it's important to start a war on ideology. It's like okay to use this state as a battlefield for my war between the EU and Russia. No, it's not, ladies and gentlemen. You're putting them in a conflict that they don't choose to be in simply because you're funding them and saying, hey, Russia, fight back, let's see what you have, right? The second thing we would tell you is that essentially when you do this, you shine a flashlight on them and you're like, hey, Russia, look what we're doing, why don't you come fight us? And you put them in a position where Russia is now intent on getting them into their conglomerate, right? They weren't in the first place, but now they're incentivized to because they don't want the EU to get the power. Why do we think this is ultimately harmful? Because there's no way the EU is going to win. Russia has more resources and Russia has a better incentive. The EU is only incentivized to add states that are going to improve their economy, whereas Russia just wants land, Russia just wants countries, Russia just wants power. They're going to develop more resources, they're going to take more risks. This means that Russia is ultimately going to win our proxy war. So why is this bad? We essentially put a target on their back because we want to help them. We essentially make it so that they for sure will be stuck with Russia and won't organically make a choice. And finally, we alienate them because they'll now be wary of associating with us because associating with us does put the target on their back. So it's because we've proven all these themes and the extra burden of this Soviet state that we're really, really proud to oppose this resolution.
Thank you, Tatiana, for the third opposition speech. Let's please welcome the second speaker, Dasha, back to the floor to offer the reply speech to the opposition.
So we think this debate today comes down to two key themes. First off, is there a moral obligation? And second off, is this beneficial for the actors involved? We think the answer to both of these questions is a no, because we won this debate today. So first off, is there a moral obligation? What did they tell you in the world beside proposition? First off, they told you that the purpose of the EU is to support democracy. These countries don't have democracy, so we have to come in and impose it on them. We gave them a number of responses. The first thing that we told you is we contested this idea in the first place. Even if they don't have democracy, ultimately the purpose of the EU right now in this situation is to be economically stable, is to have some support base of core. But furthermore, we told you that even if it's about democracy, it actually undermines that purpose. First off, because a lot of these countries aren't fully democratic. Instead of making them work towards that as a condition and then accepting them in, now you're just allowing them in, even though they might not actually uphold these values. And furthermore, we told you that if you have to bribe people in order to get them to subscribe to democracy, that isn't really the democratic thing to do, to leave that choice up to them, meaning that ultimately that isn't fair. But then we heard this idea under the world beside proposition that it's all about the ideological battle, that it's about the clash of ideologies. We gave you so many responses. First off, they never responded to our argument about how this is actually bad for post-Soviet states. So we think it's unjust if it's going to harm post-Soviet states, to treat them as this battleground, as a means to an end of fighting this broader ideological battle. Ultimately, it's going to hurt them. These people have no right to make a decision for them. But second off, they told you they stand for sovereignty. Sovereignty means being able to make up your own mind about what ideological policy you want to follow, what economic policy you want to follow. We don't think it's on their side of the house right for them to tell you that liberal views are always correct. We think these countries should be able to make their own choice. They can't make it on their side of the house because they're presenting them with a false dichotomy. On opposition, we told you that there is no moral obligation. First off, because you have an obligation to your own people first, this is going to hurt them. But second off, this is an arbitrary factor. It's not right to use them as a means to an end to fight a greater purpose. So second off, the second thing, is this beneficial for the actors involved? On side proposition, first off, they talked about economic benefits, how we're going to have more trade and a younger workforce. First off, there's massive unemployment in the EU. We don't need more younger workers. We need to fix the situation there first before we bring in new people. Ultimately, that just proves our point that economic stability is the first thing we need before bringing in new people. But furthermore, we talked to you about the domino effect. We told you that that there are more unstable actors economically, that is more likely to bring down the other actors. It's not fair to shoot yourself in the foot just because you're fighting some sort of ideological purpose that doesn't necessarily exist. It's about what's in the EU's interest as well. Then we heard on side proposition that this is going to isolate Russia and make them less powerful because they're just a minority, they're not actually effective. We told you first off that this actually angers them. They conceded that the EU's goal is actually to isolate Russia. Once Russia knows about this, which they currently do, they're incentivized to act on it. The problem is it actively hurts post-Soviet states because they prove that they're actively powerful by harming them. They do things like shut off their gas, cutting off trade by saying, look, we do have leverage over you, which is the current situation. It actively harms post-Soviet states. So what did we tell you happens in the world aside opposition? First off, it actively harms Europe because it's a waste of resources. We tell you that there's an opportunity cost. When you're in an economic situation, every penny should be saved so that you can help your own people first before you go on to competing with others. There is a dichotomy in this situation. But furthermore, we told you it's actually bad for post-Soviet states because it creates a proxy war. It creates Russia and the EU to use them to show that they're both powerful, harming them in the process. Ultimately, the world aside proposition is one that upholds country sovereignty. People should be able to decide which direction they want to go into, and they shouldn't have to decide it based on some country driving their way in, giving them this false dichotomy, either Russia or the EU. That's not the current situation. The world aside opposition is one where they really don't care about the situation in these countries. They're saying hypothetically we should fight for the greater good. That isn't the situation, that isn't what we should strive for. So ultimately, on our side of the house, we stand for sovereignty, we stand for choice, we stand for stability. Because of all these things, we won the debate today.
Thank you very much. Let's now give a warm welcome back for Emilia for the final speech for today.
Ladies and gentlemen, the reason that side opposition has to lose today's debate is twofold. Firstly, they told us there is currently economic instability in the EU. The EU only stands for promoting economic stability, and therefore we cannot join any potentially unstable state ever. We told you, ladies and gentlemen, that A, that's not necessarily what we're doing. You can't just say maybe something bad will happen and therefore we don't want to do it. But B, we tell you that they already told you and conceded that there's harm in today's debate. They didn't actually propose a solution to that harm. We did. We went on that point. Secondly, they told you that they wanted to propose that the power-crazy, power-hungry nature of Russia, which they characterized it as, needs more power so that Russia can feel okay and secure and won't hurt anybody else. Ladies and gentlemen, they can't say that, and they can't create perceived power without actually giving Russia power. So because you've conceded our harm, because you've conceded that there is some sort of benefit in being the EU, and because you haven't shown us why we actually create harms to the countries we're talking about, you've lost today's debate. I've split it up into two categories. Firstly, do we help the countries in the EU and what is the EU's purpose? And secondly, we're going to speak about angry Russia. So firstly, let's talk about the ideology of the EU. And we say that, ladies and gentlemen, the ideology of the EU is incredibly important. If all of their economic analysis stands, then we wouldn't accept any country into the EU ever, except maybe Germany. We say that certain countries and certain ideologies are important to uphold in the EU. That's why we don't only have economic restrictions on whether you can enter them, we have ideological restrictions as well. So that's really important. So, when a country is being directly oppressed, by a power that is using propaganda to oppose EU information, because that's the only realm in which today's debate actually exists, It's not one in which both sides have access to equal information, because then all of their harms don't stand. It has to be a debate in which Russia is effectively opposing the kind of EU principles that we're talking about. It has to be one in which Russia is using some sort of propaganda. So, what does that mean? It means that when Russia is using some sort of propaganda to obstruct the democratic processes that are actually working in that country, it means that we would always try and uplift those democratic processes and provide information. All of their harms in today's debate were contingent on the idea that we shouldn't accept their EU membership, not that we shouldn't provide them with the information that was going to empower them as democratic citizens. They've lost on that point already. Secondly, let's look at the economic point. So basically, we told you incredibly complex and incredibly nuanced analysis about how there's a very young workforce, about how diversity within any kind of economic ridge is important because it means you're less affected by the fluctuations of the economy of that region. We We heard no real response to this except maybe something would go wrong, so that's not enough reason to do it. Ladies and gentlemen, we say by their own analysis, we wouldn't do anything ever, they lose on that point. Then let's talk about angry Russia. So the first thing that we told you was we don't really care, right? We say that in the end, we're actually going to achieve the objective good, and that's better. Secondly, you can't give Russia perceived power without actually giving Russia power. So that angry nation that wants to cut off everybody's food and oil is necessarily given power under their state. How is that okay, ladies and gentlemen? Thirdly, we're just spreading information, and that's okay. We're not forcing anybody into any kind of situation. You don't understand the metaphor of a war on ideologies. We don't mean an actual war. Lastly, ladies and gentlemen, let's ask the question, will Russia win? And we tell you that Russia necessarily picks weak fights. We've consistently seen this. We don't think that when they go against the power of the EU, they're necessarily going to want to they're necessarily going to want to continue that fight. We've already shown you this analysis. So ladies and gentlemen, signing opposition cannot win today's debate. I'm very proud to say that Africa has stood in the heart of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you for being here, and another thank you for both teams for doing an amazing debate.